Hey guys, Joiners here coming at you with another Spire chat. Today I want to talk about Tools of the Trade. The 1 energy cost power for Silent. At the start of your turn, you draw 1 card and discard 1 card. As a power, you pay 1 energy for this, and it's in play, and you have this effect for the rest of a fight. So the reason that I'm talking about Tools of the Trade is that more than most other cards in the game at this point, Tools of the Trade seems to be a card that just gets incredibly misevaluated by people. And it seems to be a card that people so stubbornly misevaluate that even when I explain briefly to them why they're misevaluating it, rather than being like, oh, and like thinking through it, they're like, no, he must be wrong, because it's clearly really good. And it's not. Tools of the Trade is not a particularly strong Silent card. It's one of Silent's worst powers. It's a card that can fit into a deck every now and then in ways that are sort of cool, and the effect, you know, can be alright, but it's not a great card. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to make an argument for why Tools of the Trade might seem super strong, because this video, more than most of the videos I make, is like targeted at a certain person who really thinks Tools of the Trade is strong and really has a firm idea in their head of why it's strong. And I think I have a pretty good idea of where those sorts of things come from. I used to take Merfolk Looter over Fireball, pick 1, pack 1, in Magic the Gathering limited formats. And Merfolk Looter is a magic card which basically has this effect on it. It's a creature, you can play it on turn 2, and once you've played it every turn, it can draw 1 card and discard 1 card for you. And this is an incredibly powerful effect in Magic the Gathering. This effect does things like, if you have a card which isn't useful in your hand, you can draw a new card and just discard the card which isn't useful, and you're almost just drawing an extra card at that point, since you discarded a card that didn't do anything and drew a card which, you know, hopefully did do something. It can be used to get rid of bad cards in your hand. It can be used to put cards into your discard pile to interact with them there. Like, for example, you might put a massive creature into your discard pile and then play a card which reanimates it and puts it onto the battlefield instead. And all of a sudden you've sort of cheated a huge creature into play. In Magic the Gathering, this can be a very strong and powerful thing. And in Slay the Spire too, it seems like it's, you know, a beneficial thing to be able to do. There are curses in Slay the Spire, which you regularly are going to want to discard. There are, you know, statuses that enemies put in your deck, like burns, which you don't really want to keep in your hand. Drawing cards is generally good, right? Probably. You would think so. So, you know, Tools of the Trade seems like a good card or something. Cool. Yeah. That tends to be the sort of stuff that I hear from people who are talking about and analyzing whether Tools of the Trade is good. And there are some really, really, really big and important things about Slay the Spire which unanimously get completely missed. So there's some important stuff that maybe has to be talked about if you're thinking that Tools of the Trade is a great card. Number 1 thing is it's really fucking important, pardon my language, to recognize when something is a card that you have to draw and pay energy to play, versus when something is a relic that you start with the effect of on turn 1 of every fight without having to pay for it. Because Tools of the Trade is the first. So in order to start getting your effect from Tools of the Trade, first you have to draw it somehow. And unless you're bottling it, like Silent doesn't usually have access to something like Seek, so you're going to have to draw it naturally. If you have a 30 card deck with a reasonable amount of card draw, you might get this into play on turn 3 on average, turn 2 or 3. Which means that on turn 4 is the first time you draw 1 card off it, and on turn 5 is the first time that you start to be net positive on cards drawn from this card. What I mean by net positive is you had to draw 1 card to get this into play, so that's -1 card. Because in Slay the Spire, you don't have to have 40 cards in your deck or something like you do in other deck builders, right? There's no minimum deck size. You could have just chosen not to have this card in your deck. You didn't have to add it. So you're at -1 card the turn that you draw it. The next turn you get to net negative, and the turn following that you get to +1 card total. And you've invested 1 card drawn and 1 energy at that point to have drawn 1 extra card 2 turns later. And you've also discarded 2 cards. So phrased like that, in a 30-card deck, if on average on turn 5 the net output of Tools of the Trade is -1 energy, +1 card, discard 2 cards, that's not a very good card. The average fight in Slay the Spire goes to like turn 5 or 6-ish, so that's the end of the fight. It's not like you're expecting there to be a ton of time after that for Tools of the Trade to get better and better. That's the average termination point of a fight in Slay the Spire. Yeah, this is not super strong. Another thing to consider about Slay the Spire is that drawing 1 card in Slay the Spire is nowhere near as strong as drawing 1 card is in a game where you only draw 1 card per turn. Because in Slay the Spire, you draw 5 cards per turn default. Drawing 1 extra card per turn is not as strong. And discarding a card in other games might let you reanimate the card, or it might let you get rid of a card that wasn't useful right now. But in Slay the Spire, every card in your hand is going to go into your discard pile at the end of the turn by default. It just already happens. You already get that effect. This card actually reads sort of like the devs have played Magic, which I'm... I mean, yeah, the devs have played Magic to have made this game for sure. I'm sure they've talked about that in an interview or something, but I'm just going to assume this happened. And, like, they know how strong looting is in Magic and didn't think all the way through how strong it would be in this game, because, like, it's just not that strong in this game. So, yeah, like, you're already drawing 5 cards and discarding 5 cards every turn, which is something that you have to keep in mind when you're contextualizing how strong it is to draw 1 card and discard 1 card every turn. It's not a particularly unique thing to be able to do, and it's not super strong. Okay. That's like gargantuan huge thing number 1 is, oh, I guess that's 2 things. 1, it's a power, you have to draw and play it. You have to actually impartially look at what its overall output is. And 2, looting just isn't as, it's nowhere near as strong in this game. Even the synergies with Tactician and Reflex, these synergies are not that strong. They're not incredible synergies. Discarding curses is not that strong. Just don't put curses in your deck. It's generally better. Even if you do need to discard curses, this is not a very good way to do it, because anytime you draw a card off backflip, for example, you don't get an opportunity to discard the curse. So if you have like a normality in your deck, having Tools of the Trade does not mean that you can play a deck with a normality in it. You have to still do some very weird things in order to get away with having a normality in your deck, even if you have tools. So the next big thing to examine is, I think a lot of people come into Slay the Spire without having any framework to contextualize what it means for a card to front load versus what it means for a card to scale. And that is the fabric of Slay the Spire. You have cards which front load and you have cards with scale, and there isn't really anything in between. There's a bit of gray here and there, but mostly it's black and white, and it's very important to understand. So like in Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone or something like that, most of your cards do both. Like, a creature gets onto the board, and by doing so immediately affects the board straight away, protecting your health total and letting you maybe stop creatures who have special effects when they hit you or something like that. And also the creature adds to your board presence and starts to accumulate maybe card advantage with some sort of ability or something like that. In Hearthstone, similarly, as you play stuff on curve that goes onto the board, it immediately fights for control of the board, and it can also often, like, it will discover a card for you, or it will leverage something else to try to scale you up and get you stronger. And Hearthstone also has inbuilt scaling in that every turn you get 1 more mana, which Slay the Spire doesn't have. So scaling is not something that you have to get out of your cards in Hearthstone, because you're already getting an extra mana every single turn. But in Slay the Spire, when you play Die Die Die, it's just gone. It's just gone. It's done. You pay your energy and your card drawn, and Die 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 goes off, but that's it. That's over. This is a front-loaded card in Slay the Spire. Similarly, like Piercing Wail. When you play Piercing Wail, one of the best front-loaded cards in the game, all the enemies lose 6 strength this turn, but that's done. Having played Piercing Wail does not help you in any way for the next turn. It hasn't controlled the board. It hasn't, like, it hasn't set you up. You haven't made another land drop or gained another energy for the next turn. You've just played a Piercing Wail, and that was one front-loaded card, and it got you through this turn, but it has not helped you at all for the next turn. So these are front-loaded cards, and front-loaded cards are super important. And often you can win entire fights using only front-loaded cards. You can Piercing Wail every turn against Book of Stabbing while playing like some attacks like Dagger Throws and Dagger Sprays or something, and you can win that fight in a Backstab or something like that. Cool. Congratulations. You have successfully won a hallway fight with only front-loaded cards, and that's awesome. But there are fights in this game where you really sort of need to scale. Fights like boss fights, fights like Giant Head, you often need to scale. And in order to win those fights, instead of just relying on these cards which are front-loaded, you want to add some cards which let you scale to your deck. But you want to do that in a way which is efficient, so that your deck can still win fights where it needs to front-load. And you want to do that in a way which pertains to things that you need to do in those fights to win them. And things which you can't get out of cards which just have front-loaded output already. So some cards which are very good at scaling for Silent are like Footwork. Once you play Footwork, all of your block cards block for 2 or upgraded 3 more block. And that's really, really strong, especially you couple that with Dodge and Roll, and Footwork goes off twice, and all of a sudden Dodge and Roll is, instead of making 8 block, it's making 12 block or 14 block, and that's a really big thing. The fact that you got through that turn with like a Piercing Wail or something to block for that turn, and deployed a Footwork, is setting you up to be stronger on the next turn. Deck is scaling in some way. Again, you don't get to make land drops, you don't gain mana just from passing your turn, so you need to scale if you scale. Footwork's a card that can do that. In the same way that Footwork blocks for you after Image can block for you. Well-Laid Plans I would call a card that scales because it adds to your deck the ability to retain a card, so you can have the right card for the right moment all of a sudden. And there are a lot of cards which scale damage. So all of a sudden, if I have 1,000 cuts in play, instead of dealing damage only by playing a card like Skewer, now every time I play block cards, I deal damage. I've created this new powerful thing that my deck does. The deck is now stronger than before. As I accumulate powerful things like this, I get to a point where I can trivialize even the scariest boss fights of the game. So powers which deal damage are like 1,000 cuts, and Noxious Fumes and Caltrops can be particularly good against some enemies. And Silent also has very relevant damage scaling through poison cards. These are cards which are not powers, but they're still scaling damage for you. So Crippling Cloud applies 4 poison to weak to all enemies. This is a card which not only scales damage for you. After you play Crippling Cloud, all enemies have 4 poison on them, which is going to deal damage over the course of multiple turns. The next turn, an enemy's taking poison damage as well because you've done this turn. You're setting stuff up that does more powerful things in the future. But it also weakens enemies. So it's also doing something front-loaded. So Crippling Cloud is a scaling thing which you can do which doesn't cost you as much in terms of what you're able to do this turn. And you can say the same about like Footwork is it's a scaling thing which you can play first thing in the turn, and then all of your block cards this turn block for more. So it doesn't cost you as much in a front-loaded way. Similarly, 1,000 Cuts, when you play this, you deal damage that turn. So it doesn't cost you as much front-loaded damage. 1,000 Cuts plus, especially, is a card that you can get down against Reptimancer, and it won't slow you down so much that you can't kill Reptimancer's daggers. You can get this down and still be dealing enough damage to survive that fight. It doesn't like cost you quite as much tempo, to use an idea from Magic the Gathering. Noxious Fumes is a power which is very, very powerful, but does have a large front-loaded cost. This is energy that does nothing for you for 2 turns. So the fact that it's dealing truckloads of damage justifies that, and if your deck is able to cope with not having damage for a while because it is very good at blocking, or because the enemy scales up slowly itself or something like that, then Noxious Fumes can be great. But Noxious Fumes can actually be pretty bad if your deck is like sort of slow. If your deck can't block for enough to have to be able to wait for this damage to show up. So we talked about Crippling Cloud, Catalyst is scaling damage, Bouncing Flask is scaling damage. There are also mitigative things which scale, like Malaise. Malaise scales for you and doesn't cost you as much on the turn that you play it. So if you have an enemy attacking you for 8x3, you play Malaise. Not only are you making it so it attacks for 3x3 when you play Malaise for 3 energy, but you're making it so it attacks for 3x3 this turn, so you've done something front-loaded, and 3x3 next turn. You've done something scaling as well. Nightmare can be a card which scales, because you can create 3 other cards which scale, basically, but also because you can create 3 good front-loaded cards. If you have, like, Cloak and Daggers in your deck and they're very good for a fight, you can Nightmare Cloak and Daggers, and all of a sudden your deck draws Cloak and Dagger way more often, which has scaled your deck usefully. Wraithform scales you because all of a sudden you don't take any damage. This is a ridiculous card, which is just super, super, super strong, and Venom's another damage scaling card. There are all these very powerful ways that Silent can scale. And the balance that you're trying to tread on Silent is you're trying to work out how to front load enough stuff to get your scaling deployed without taking a bunch of damage. The Silent typically doesn't have sustain, so if you're taking a lot of damage in hallway fights, you're going to like lose the run off that, quite likely. You need to make sure that the front of your deck's output is packed with enough stuff to not only survive the early turns, but also deploy scaling for the later turn, actually fight more convincingly. And that, again, is why a card like Piercing Wail, which just blocks for a ton this turn against an 8x3 enemy, it's blocking for 18 for 1 energy. Against 3 enemies, it's blocking for 18 for 1 energy. Against the Book of Stabbing, it may be blocking for 30 for 1 energy. A card like this is very important for Silent to be able to deploy her scaling. A card like Crippling Cloud, which weakens everything, may be blocking for 15 and also setting up poison to deal damage on subsequent turns. These are very important cards for Silent. And as you accumulate enough of that front-loaded stuff to survive the early turns, you have to fit in some scaling cards which scale your deck in like the most bang for your buck way possible. So Noxious Fumes is often the best one that you'll get offered as a damage card because it's uncommon and because it just deals more damage than Caltrops in a lot of fights. So this is a card that you're basically earning the right to get into play. Your other cards are earning you the right to get Noxious Fumes into play. Footwork is a card where you're almost always taking this because it costs you so little on the turn that you play it. It already makes block as you play it. If you're playing 2 other block cards, then it's basically blocking for 4 that turn already, and then the next turn it blocks for more as well. Identifying which of these cards are the right ones to put into your deck and making sure that you're not putting too many in so that your deck is starting to suck at front loading is very important. You generally speaking, want enough scaling to beat boss fights, and it's generally speaking pretty knowable how much you need. There is a lot less randomness in general to a boss fight where you're going to go multiple turns, and over the course of the first 4 or 5 turns you will draw all of the cards in your deck, than there is to a hallway fight where the fight may only last 4 or 5 turns. So in the boss fight, from probably the last like half least of the fight, you're going to have all of your scaling cards in play if you want to, because you will have drawn them and been able to play them. And you can pay some health to get them into play, and that's fine. But in a hallway fight, for most of the fight, you don't have your scaling cards in play, because the fight doesn't last long enough, and it's not okay to pay health to get them into play, because if you're paying health in hallway fights, you're setting yourself behind, you're having to rest at campfires, you're maybe just dying to hallway fights. This is bad. The way that you navigate those fights ends up being very different, and because of that, it can be quite knowable how much scaling you have, because how much scaling you have to have, because you have the leeway to pay some health in the boss fight to get your scaling into play. And once you have your scaling in play, it's like a known quantity. You know how much it does and what it's for. So in this context, Tools of the Trade, this just doesn't scale much. It just doesn't do much. Drawing a card and discarding a card is not comparable to footwork at all. It may very well not make you any more block in a turn, where footwork made you 4 block on the turn you played it, and will then make you more block on the next turn, the next turn, the next turn after that. If you've built a deck where you like deploy your scaling stuff and then play backflips, Tools of the Trade may be literal dead weight doing nothing. Because like you always have a backflip, and then you just play a backflip and then another backflip and then another backflip when you've blocked all your stuff. If you have a well-laid plan so that you like know that you have one important card that you can play at the start of next turn every time, Tools of the Trade is usually not going to do anything for you. Again, like you have like your backflip in hand that you hold onto, and all of a sudden, because you're holding onto a backflip with well-laid plans, it's almost impossible for you to draw a bad hand. You have the backflip plus 5 more cards plus another 2 cards that you draw with backflip. You're looking at 8 cards next turn minimum, and presumably you didn't fill your deck with like unmitigated shit. You get to choose which cards you put into your deck, so presumably in those 8 cards you have some pretty good stuff, right? This card does nothing on the turn you play it. It deals no damage and blocks for nothing ever. This card just doesn't scale very well. And you just, if you are looking at Tools of the Trade and you're thinking this card is great and you're able to identify powerful things that it does and you're really excited to put it in your deck, you're just like, you're playing the wrong game. It's just not very good. Typically, I think that the way to arrive at thinking Tools of the Trade is good through experience playing Slay the Spire is playing Slay the Spire like at a difficulty lower than the maximum difficulty, or playing Slay the Spire with no expectation of winning as much as you could actually achieve winning, and playing Slay the Spire in a way where like you try to build decks which do something once they're set up. And when you're trying to build decks which do something when they're set up, it's like, oh cool, I draw an extra card and discard a card every turn. That's sort of fun. So I can like turn on Sneaky Strike for myself or something like that, right? And now it deals 10 damage and costs net 0 energy. So I've made a slice that's twice as good. What an incredible card. And like, cool, I guess. But if you're doing that, you're not really interfacing with what Slay the Spire is very much at all. You're like, you're like enjoying building a deck that sets up and does something arbitrary without actually interacting with like, oh, you can't just spend forever setting up in hallway fights or you'll lose health and then die. Without interacting with like, well, against Awakened One, if you play Tools of the Trade, Awakened One gets 2 more strength and attacks you for 8 more damage next turn. And also, just playing 2 Footworks against Awakened One would have let you block forever against that fight, because it doesn't scale in any other way, the enemy. Yeah, I don't know, it's just not very good. And hopefully how I've explained that has helped to explain why and set up the framework that you need to be working in for this game to analyze cards better. Because the framework that you have to be working in to think that Tools of the Trade is a good card here is a really weird framework and isn't very good at winning at Play the Spire. Like, just, I don't know, like, compare it to Footwork, compare it to Piercing Wail, compare it to Crippling Cloud. Just like, look at what the math is on how much defense it gives you and how much damage it gives you for a card that you have to draw and pay energy for a card that often you would be adding to your deck over a different rare card, because this is a rare card. You're likely to be regularly seeing it as a boss reward against 2 other rare cards, or as a rare card in a store for a large gold cost. And you'll hopefully recognize that it just doesn't do as much as the other stuff you can get in this game. So, thanks for hanging out. Enjoying Rips. Hope you enjoyed the chat. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.